Welcome everyone. In today's webinar, we have Raahul Srinivasan joining us today. He will be sharing how he has his journey around AI product management, artificial intelligence product management, and he is a Bay Area native. He has been here for 12 years in tech. He's been in tech for 12 years, and during the pandemic, he joined ServiceNow as a principal AI platform product manager and has been enjoying the new environment in an enterprise-sized organization. He loves creating product experiences for consumers and explaining complex concepts in an intuitive way. His experience as a magician, by the way, he worked as a magician and as a performer. So his experience in that area has fueled his love for people and stories. And that translates very well when it comes to working on large cross-functional teams to ship beautiful and meaningful products. So with that, we'll get started on the first former, I'm really curious about what's your story, Raahul. How did you get into product management? What's your day-to-day like? And how has your journey been so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's especially an interesting role because people fall into it from all sorts of different walks of life, if you will. So for me, I started with a background in electrical engineering with a biomedical emphasis. I wanted to go into robotics and building prosthetics when I was really in college.
Wow.
That timing didn't work out super well because I graduated right at the bottom of a recession and no company wanted to hire anybody unless they had a PhD in biomedical engineering. So I ended up finding a first startup. I took a role as a business analyst, and in parallel with that, figured, okay, let me continue sharpening some skills, add some more tools to the toolbox. And I did a master's in signal processing with electrical engineering, continuing to keep that dream alive a little bit. And as I did it, I realized that, small startup, moved to a consulting company where I was a full stack developer for 4 or 5 years. And I learned a ton on the job. And I'd say that number one thing in figuring out the path here is lots of different varied experiences and saying, I liked it, but not enough. And so as I did that, I realized I wanted to be near tech. I love talking about tech, but writing code was not the dream job for me. And as I progressed, I realized, I think I like tech more than I like technology for health and all of that. But I wasn't 100% certain. I decided it was time to go to a big company for a little bit. So I moved to data science at Facebook for about 1.5 years, 2 years. I spent my time there and I started business school in parallel. So I did business school because at that point I was pretty certain product marketing or product management was the path. So I figured that would open some doors. It would allow me to shortcut a lot of the be an associate PM for some number of years kind of work. And I had a background in tech already, so I thought it might be a good path. And as I finished B school, I decided, okay, it was time to go take the plunge. And for the 6 months after Facebook, I created a role for myself in some ways as a consulting PM. So I had a background in data, and I just went to a bunch of different startups that were looking to hire PMs and said, I have a background in data and I want to be a product manager. And I know there's this catch-22 of you need product management experience to be a product manager. Take me on as a consultant, take me on as a part-time hire, I'll do some work for you. And I found a couple of roles in a couple of different industries. So segment one was ad tech, which I had a strong background in from Facebook. Segment number 2 was health tech. And segment number 3 was also health tech, but 2 different varying scales. One was a startup with about 30 people, and one was a full-scale enterprise, Athena Health. And down that path, and one of those turned into a full-time job offer, and I took it and did it for 1.5 years, and then realized that health tech, I liked it. I liked the tech part. I definitely liked the PM part, and I had the skills built up. But at the end of the day, I wanted to be in a pure technology company because it was going to move a little faster. So at that point, I moved to a startup called Alio. Alio, I was joined as the first product manager. I was employee, I believe, 18 or 19 there. And I worked for a year and a half as the only product manager at that company. We grew from 20 to about 200, and we grew product management, et cetera. But it was a really great experience. I learned a ton. And that was in the HR recruitment space, but also happened to dovetail with AI because we had an NLU powered chatbot that was, how do you hire candidates? How do you screen candidates and schedule them? So I got to build some video interviewing technology. I got to play with some integrations with really large companies. And I also got to play with pure product, from talking to candidates as well as recruiters. What do you need from that space? And so as an external facing product management role, I learned what processes were needed in a company that had none, from 20 people to having 200 people and multiple orgs. And then COVID happened. And because that was a high volume hiring industry, it wasn't a great time. It was the time to move to the next thing. An opportunity came along, and found myself at ServiceNow doing AI product platform management.
Wow. Yeah. So many questions come up in my mind as you describe your journey.
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I turned off my video, by the way, because you're the star of the show, right? So I just wanted to put the spotlight on
problem.
you. And my question, following up on, by the way, we have a few people joining us, and there may be more joining us, but wanted to let you guys know that there will be a Q&A where you can ask a live question. I'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask a live question to Raahul in about 20 minutes. We'll open up the line so you can actually interact with us and ask Raahul your questions. So with that, my first question was more along the lines of, you have this amazing data background, and what are some of the things that would that stand out for AI platform? Like, what is AI platform product management in the first place? What does that mean, and what kind of role is it? What do you do day to day?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it can vary greatly, but I'll start by saying it requires all of the traditional product management skills. So that, I think, is a starting point. And maybe some of them are less important. I would say UX becomes slightly less important. Technology becomes slightly more important. But at the end of the day, it's cross-functional in nature, and it's more cross-functional than a lot of other product management roles. So to give you a sense in what my day-to-day is, there's everything from working with internal developers who are working to use our platform to build new features. There's chatting with customers who have issues with or need guidance on some of our features. There is conversations with legal, data governance, compliance, risk management that all apply, because AI fundamentally means data, and that means that world is involved. And then there is conversations with engineering teams in terms of operationalization, as well as infrastructure capacity and load and that sort of conversation. And then there's conversations with data scientists, because there's a fundamental difference between the software development lifecycle as it is traditionally and with AI, which is there's a lot more experimentation and iteration. There's a lot less certainty, and there's a lot more, I will call it a research aspect, if you will.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's something I would love to unpack with you. How do you manage that friction if when you're working with your traditional software development lifecycle engineering teams, and now you bring in this model development lifecycle? Is there, first of all, I don't want to make any assumptions, is there any friction there when you bring in this new style of developing products? And then second is, how do you manage that? Yeah,
no, I think that's a fair question. I don't think there's always friction. I think there can be. It really depends on Are you working at a company that is trying to bring in AI software development lifecycle after years of traditional software development? Or is it a new company that is starting from ground zero? So I think the friction there is change management, the same as any other process change management that exists in product management. With how do you address it? I think there's a lot of avenue for a product manager to be the change agent. So you build trust with your partners. It's how do you educate folks on why it is different, how it is different, and how it is difficult. And if you can do those things, you will have inherently a connection with those people and an ability to have a conversation around the actual problems instead of the frustration or tension that you're describing.
Yeah, that is so on point. Like, it's no different than any other traditional change management, right? So that's very much that's very much a product manager's hat right there.
Yep. And I'll quote, actually, like Bill McDermott said has said multiple times before, to my knowledge, you build trust in drops and you lose it in buckets. And I think that's super accurate.
That's so true. Build trust in drops and you lose it in buckets. I will make sure to meditate on that for a few days. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Hey, so for the folks who are not familiar with AI, what is that model? Is that a framework, model lifecycle development, or AI lifecycle development? Or if that's are there any other such frameworks that you normally use in your day-to-day that you would like to share with us? So yeah, I know it's a question, but yeah,
no,
you can share that.
It's a big question, and I think my personal belief is that there are a lot of great frameworks out there, right? And I'm by no means the expert of frameworks. In fact, I have a very good friend who loves frameworks and has turned me on to a few podcasts with various frameworks and analyzed, right? And I think that's important. But at the end of the day, the framework I care about the most is know your audience, know what they want, and then know how to convince them. I think that's how you choose what framework makes sense. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you're talking to a legal team around data needs, your framework is not necessarily entirely driven in technology feasibility requirements. And so indexing to that is not going to work. And similarly, when you put AI practitioner in front of legal, that conversation, you have to be that bridge. You have to be able to translate from one language to the other. And that's the framework that matters. So here is the risk and here is the reward. And that conversation is fundamentally more valuable. And there, I wouldn't say there's a specific framework that matters. That said, I'll go back to educating your audience. So if neither side understands the problems the other is facing, you run into problems as well. The AI practitioner sees the problem of, I don't get access to what I want. And the legal team only sees, hey, there's risk. So how do you make sure that those two teams are hearing and talking in the same language? There's an inherent relationship between the data and the risk. How do you manage it?
Yeah. And that's like a hot question for most of the organizations that are trying to innovate and trying to use AI in their product development lifecycle. How do you bridge that gap? How do you communicate to so many different stakeholders? And that especially makes AI product management a challenging role. Have you found any communication approaches or empathy building approaches or persuasion approaches that has worked effectively for you or your colleagues, Raahul?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I go back to like magic as a performance and storytelling. It is really, let's get aligned on what the story we want to tell is. If we're wanting to tell the story that an AI practitioner is able to work with and manipulate data in this new AI software development lifecycle, which means I have 40 different approaches I want to try, and I whittle it down to 10, and then I need to try it against real data. And out of that, I get a model that I will be able to go and work with the customer with. Now, fundamentally, even in that statement, there's a lot of education that can be done, right? The fundamental software development lifecycle is develop the algorithm, input plus algorithm equals output. In AI development, it's input plus output equals algorithm. And then you take new input plus the algorithm equals probabilistic output. Now, it's not deterministic. So even when you get to the last step, you may have to throw away everything you've done. So how do you make sure that you're bringing people along that journey early and often? Hey, today this is what I'm expecting, but tomorrow it could change. Here's the range of what I'm expecting. As people, as humans, we are really bad at probabilistic conversations. And so that is one of the biggest challenges that I think exists. And how do you shift that? So to me, that trust building that you're referring to comes from education first. And education happens best if you can, in my mind, if you can anchor to a story, because people remember stories, they don't remember facts. So they remember what the story is, the feeling of security. How do you do X, Y, and Z? Oh, well, I know that that story of the AI practitioner doing these things in this secure way gets me to some outcome. And I think that's a large part of it.
Very interesting. You remind me of this book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I'm sure you heard of that.
I don't think I have.
Yeah, it's a great book. But what you brought up is like so on point about probabilistic thinking versus deterministic thinking. And even outside of tech, we are so used to with deterministic thinking, and thinking in bets, thinking in probabilities would serve humanity so much better than thinking in this fixed pie approach, right? So thank you for sharing that. What any ideas around like how do you recommend, like how did you cultivate storytelling skills? You are such a great communicator and you can articulate this complex things so well. What are some of the ways you cultivated storytelling and this charismatic ability to persuade people using this different approaches? Like, yeah, if you can share some of that.
That's a really good question. And I think it's one that I unfortunately don't have a great answer to. I think if I knew how to cultivate it, I'd be a really rich person. But I think the shortest answer I can say is fail at persuading people a lot, right? I think you learn what works for you by trial and error. And I grew up in a family that was really open to discussion and debate, and I was really lucky for that. I did Lincoln Douglas debate in high school and I loved it. So I think being able to take on one side of the argument, flip, and take on the other side of an argument is a really valuable skill. And I think if you know what the other person wants, working backwards from that to your point of view is way stronger than just butting heads from two different opposing points of view. So to me, that's the crux of storytelling. So if you can find, I think there's a term in film and storytelling and media res, right? Which is starting in the middle of the action. In the same way, in any conversation, we can all agree on some middle point. Start there. So, hey, we all know that we need X, Y, and Z in order to move forward. Okay, well, what's blocking us from getting X today? Well, from my perspective, it's this. From my perspective, it's this. Great, how do we bridge that gap? And I think that's the kind of storytelling, if you can pre-read people or pre-brief people on those statements where everybody's agreed and they understand the gaps, then getting to an outcome is a lot better.
Wow. Okay, that's so valuable right there. You connected two completely different areas, but then you were able to bridge them so well. Like in storytelling and in media and in movies, it's always starting from somewhere in the middle, and then you unpack it. And yeah, that's, find the common alignment and then start from there. I'm going to try that too.
Yeah. And I think the other part is just it's not something you can teach, but you can train yourself to genuinely care about other people. And I don't mean so much like hey, how are you doing sort of care, but like curiosity. How do you instill curiosity? If I could only teach one thing, that's what I would want to teach. And the example that I would give is like, I noticed before you turned off your video, you have a bunch of chess pieces in your background. So I was going to ask you, are you a chess player? I'm just curious. And then what's your rating? And do you play tournaments? Like, you have a bunch of interesting art in your background. What's that mandala thing? So if you're just asking those questions, you're inherently connecting with someone. And I think that connection leads to a desire to want to help the other person more.
Got it. Yeah.
And it's not sort of an intentional thing. It's not, oh, if I do this, they will help me. It is, I am genuinely curious.
Yeah, that brings up an important point, Rahul, which is curiosity is such an important behavioral trait for product managers. What are some of the other traits that you have seen specifically for AI platform PMs that you think are critical for them to succeed in that role? Any other behavioral traits come to your mind?
Yeah, so there's a few. So first of all, I think in general for product management, there are some fundamental traits. Communication, I think, is a baseline trait. And no matter what your level of communication is, your ability to communicate to somebody from a different opinion, point of view, stature, you have to find a way to do that, and you can always grow. But outside of that, I think there are 4 key component areas where people can grow strengths: user experience, data, engineering or technology, and business. I think I didn't name any of those twice. So business, data, technology.
Yeah, you didn't name any of them twice. Yeah, you're right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
UX, right.
Yeah.
So if you think about those areas, I don't think you need to grow all of them at the same rate. And I also don't think you need to grow all of them. I believe in finding your strengths and doubling down. But I would say in an AI platform PM role, you want to have strengths in technology, probably first and foremost. Secondly, I would say data, and business is almost the last thing. And I say that because fundamentally as a platform PM, you are not an immediate term revenue generator. You have to develop longer term thinking. You're thinking about 5 years from now, what can I enable my revenue generating teams to do? And so that character trait of not seeking the immediate gratification is a super important one.
That's such an important point. Most of the PMs, they want this home runs, right? And it takes so many years for a platform PM to hit a home run, and it takes so much more strategic thinking and so much more delayed gratification to have that impact. Yeah, it takes a few years just to build a platform and to bring products on top of it. So yeah, that's it's in a sense, it's the most entrepreneurial role ever, because you have to put off gratification much farther out than most of the other roles. And thank you for sharing that. I never thought of it in that way until now. So I really appreciate you bridging this gap. One thing,
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, Rahul, is how would someone who is not having an engineering background get into AI platform product management? Or is that even feasible? Is that even possible to do for someone? I mean, sure, it's possible. Anything is possible, but just curious.
Yeah, I think it is very possible. I think it's a really interesting question. So I think if someone does have a real interest in the technical nature of AI and ML, in general, I think a platform PM, by the way, requires more technical knowledge than almost any other form of product management. ability for somebody who doesn't have an engineering background to get that knowledge is very much there. I think the first step for me, I point people to the Udemy course on AI product management frequently because it does talk about the differences. And then the next thing I would say is Python is available for most people with a laptop. So go understand linear regression. And I think there are really basic packages. There are open source data sets. Look at the stock market as an example and run some regressions and understand what it means. And really, if you can get one technical understanding of one AI ML capability in specific supervised learning and specifically regression, I think you have a good grasp then where you're able to talk about other problems in the similar space, whether it is clustering, natural language understanding, because the technologies and the ways that those things happen are all fundamentally similar. They're all matrix math at the end of the day. And the question is, are you doing it super fast? Are you doing it with some interesting twist? But if you've done it once, or you have done it in some capacity, understanding the other aspects will be easier.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I never, I don't think you need like a 7 years of technological experience or technology education to be able to be a successful platform product manager. Having curiosity, going back to your original point, is more than enough of a driver. So with that,
but I would say,
yeah, go ahead.
To your point there, though, right? Like that 7 years of background in technology will certainly help. There's certainly some, like, I don't think somebody who hasn't had 7 years of experience will be able to make good judgment calls on what KPIs they might want to keep in mind. And I think it's the same as learning how to drive. A new driver does not have the awareness to say, hey, this on-ramp on this part of the freeway near me has a really short on-ramp, so I need to look over there before I merge as I'm coming around the corner. In a similar way, an AI platform PM, as they're thinking of a new feature, needs to be thinking about latency. How's that going to affect the performance of my whole system? How is this going to end result in model drift or degradation for my end use case over time? So it's those sorts of, like, experience does build on itself and it creates some wisdom. So there's something to be said for that as well.
100%, 100%. And we're going to open up for questions in a second now. So start unmuting yourself. Start raising your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. My follow-up question for you is, so feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions for Raahul. But I'm just going to continue this conversation. One last point, Raahul, to your point earlier that you made, which is experience does help, and more importantly, the experience and curiosity that you mentioned help a lot, right? So the part that I want to bring to this conversation is that if you screw up as a AI platform PM, the ramifications are huge because you're looking at a scale. You're looking at a scale that are, you're going to impact so many things as a platform PM, as an AI platform PM, and those things can really impact your customers or your stakeholders. So not only is the experience going to help build you the knowledge and be more competent, but also help you avoid some of those expensive mistakes, right? So yeah.
Completely.
Yeah.
I think that's totally valid. I think this is where it's really, in a platform AI PM role, you're very lucky to work with some really smart people. Like, generally speaking, you're working hand in hand with architects who've built an AI platform and have years of experience. So I will say, in that sense, the risk of making a technical mistake is often very low because you have all eyes on the problem. The questions of mistakes come from lack of consideration in whatever dimension. And that's something that you can crowdsource within your own company, have a trusted set of, personal board, if you will. Oh, I'm working on this problem at work and I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z. What am I missing? And even at work, having that same conversation across your peers is extremely valuable.
Yeah, I really like that suggestion, having your personal board and crowdsourcing the considerations. And that really is a traditional PM. That is really a traditional PM, skill, right? So yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's very helpful, very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, any questions from, I think we have a few attendees. Any questions from anyone here at this point? Otherwise, we're going to start wrapping this up. So now is your time to ask that question you have, or connect with Rahul if you have any questions for him. Rahul, while we are waiting for questions, if there are any, is there like any book or podcast or course or training that you recommend for people to improve their skills in this area?
That's a really good question. So
And it doesn't have to be technical, it could be non-technical or anything, it could be anything that has personally helped you.
yeah, so the non-technical one is what comes to mind, and I know that in preparing for this, you'd asked me sort of for a favorite quote, right? And I struggled with it because I had a lot. And one of the ones that I wanted to use was from a dear friend that actually passed away about a year ago to tomorrow. And he talked about, if you're looking for inspiration, look to any art. We were magicians, so he would say, take any book about painting and replace the word art with magic, and you'll be amazed with what you see. Okay, interesting. And he says, do the same with books about literature. Replace literature with magic, and you'll see what you can see. And I think the same is true for product management. So I think you can take the words for magic or art and replace them with product and user, and you will see some really interesting, not intuitive connections. And they still ring true. And I think, he says, you cannot, the quote I gave you was also from him, which was, you cannot promise the spectator a unicorn and give them a poorly disguised goat. Hey, the same true for product management. You can't promise a user a unicorn and provide them a poorly disguised goat. And I think that sentiment holds true. And so some of these thoughts are universal, and it generally holds. What connects with you or resonates with you from an artistic sense usually holds some meaning or value in a professional sense as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday afternoon with us, Rahul. I really enjoyed this conversation. You are so knowledgeable, and I appreciate every minute of the time spent together. I'll be sharing this with our community. Now is the time when I'm going to stop recording. So here we go.